He thought humiliating her would be easy, the kind of effortless entertainment that fills a slow afternoon. But what Jake Reynolds didn't realize as he leaned against the polished counter of the indoor range was that he had just stepped into a moment that would quietly dismantle everything he believed about skill, judgment, and the people he thought he could read at a glance. The air carried that familiar scent of oil and metal, fluorescent lights reflecting off neatly arranged lanes stretching out to 25 yards, and the low hum of casual conversation echoed between concrete walls as regulars adjusted their stance and checked their targets. A routine day, predictable, controlled, until she walked in. Emily Carter didn't make an entrance. She didn't need to. Her presence was almost invisible at first glance. A simple woman in faded denim and a soft gray sweater, her hair pulled back in a way that suggested practicality over style, moving with a calm that didn't match the environment, like someone who wasn't trying to impress or prove anything. And maybe that was exactly why Jake noticed her, because in a place where confidence was often loud, hers was completely silent. He watched her from across the room, eyes narrowing slightly as he assessed what he thought he already understood. Another beginner, another curious visitor, someone who would hesitate at the weight of the equipment and laugh nervously after a few attempts, and the corners of his mouth lifted, just enough to signal what was coming next. "You sure you're in the right place?" he called out, his voice carrying just enough to draw attention without seeming outright rude. A practiced tone, the kind that invited others to join in the judgment without feeling responsible for it. And a couple of nearby patrons glanced over, smirking quietly, waiting for her reaction, waiting for the moment she would shrink, apologize, or walk away. But Emily didn't stop, didn't respond. She simply continued forward with measured steps, her eyes steady, scanning the space not with uncertainty, but with something else, something Jake couldn't quite place, and that unsettled him in a way he didn't expect. "This isn't exactly a beginner's class," he added, pushing just a little further, his voice sharper now, inviting laughter that came in small, scattered bursts, the kind that feeds on discomfort. And still, she said nothing, not even a glance in his direction, as if his words had no weight at all. The room shifted subtly, curiosity replacing amusement as people began to watch more closely, sensing that something about this interaction wasn't unfolding the way it usually did, and Jake felt it too, that slight imbalance, that moment where control started to slip, though he couldn't explain why. Emily reached the lane, her fingers brushing lightly against the counter as if grounding herself in the space, her posture relaxed but precise. And for a split second, there was a stillness around her, the kind that doesn't demand attention but somehow commands it anyway. And Jake, unwilling to let the moment pass without reclaiming dominance, stepped closer, his shoes echoing against the polished floor as he leaned in just enough for his voice to carry clearly. "Tell you what," he said, a hint of challenge threading through his tone. "If you're going to be here, at least make it interesting." And the room quieted just a fraction more, conversations fading into the background as anticipation began to build, because everyone knew what came next, the setup, the test, the moment where someone like her would be exposed. And Jake smiled, confident in the outcome he had already written in his mind, completely unaware that the story had already begun to write itself in a very different direction. The smile on Jake Reynolds' face widened just enough to signal that he had found his stage, and the moment he straightened his posture and clapped his hands once, sharp and deliberate, the low conversations around the range faded into a curious hush, because everyone recognized that tone, that shift, the beginning of something meant to entertain at someone else's expense. And without breaking eye contact with Emily Carter, he gestured toward the far end of the lane where a fresh set of targets had just been clipped into place at exactly 25 yards, their clean white surfaces almost glowing under the overhead lights, untouched, waiting, like a blank canvas he fully expected her to ruin. "Let us see what you have," he said, his voice smooth but edged with condescension, and a few people stepped closer, leaning against the dividers, folding their arms, already preparing their reactions before anything had even happened, because in their minds, the outcome was predictable. A simple woman out of her depth, another quiet embarrassment to pass the time. Emily did not respond immediately, and that pause, that fraction of stillness, stretched longer than it should have. long enough to make Jake shift his weight slightly, long enough for someone in the back to whisper, "She is going to back out." But she did not. Instead, she stepped forward with the same measured calm, her gaze moving across the range as if she were mapping something invisible, something no one else could see. And when her fingers rested lightly against the edge of the counter again, there was a subtle precision in the movement, like a habit formed over time rather than a gesture of uncertainty. Jake noticed it, even if he did not understand it, and it irritated him more than it should have, because confidence was supposed to look a certain way in this place: loud, assertive, proven, not quiet, not controlled, not like this. "You ever done this before?" he asked, his tone sharper now, pressing for a reaction, any reaction, but Emily simply gave a small nod. Not exaggerated, not defensive, just enough to acknowledge the question without inviting more, and that answer, or lack of one, triggered a ripple of amusement from the small crowd, because it sounded like nothing, it looked like nothing, and Jake seized on that instantly. "Well, then let us make it fair," he continued, raising his voice slightly so everyone could hear. "We do not want you getting overwhelmed." The words wrapped in false consideration that only made the underlying mockery clearer, and a few people chuckled again, louder this time, encouraged by his lead. He reached for a folded cloth from the counter, holding it up between his fingers like a prop, and there it was, the escalation, the moment designed to push her past comfort into failure, the kind of challenge that always broke beginners, always exposed them, always delivered the reaction he wanted. "How about we take away the easy part?" he said, tilting his head, watching her closely now, searching for hesitation. No sight, just instinct. And the room leaned in again, anticipation sharpening, because now it was not just a test, it was a spectacle. For the first time, Emily's eyes shifted directly to the cloth, and something flickered there, not fear, not doubt, but recognition, quick and quiet, gone almost as soon as it appeared, and Jake missed it entirely, too focused on the narrative he was building, too certain of how this would end. "Unless you would rather not," he added, giving her what sounded like an exit but was really another push, another layer of pressure meant to force her into retreat, and the silence that followed felt heavier now, charged, as every person in the room waited for her to decline, to step back, to confirm everything they already believed. But instead, Emily reached out, her hand steady as she took the cloth from his fingers, and in that simple motion, something shifted again, subtle but undeniable, like the air tightening just a fraction more, like the room itself was beginning to realize it might have misread the story unfolding in front of them, even if no one was ready to admit it yet. The moment Emily Carter took the cloth from Jake Reynolds' hand, the energy in the room shifted in a way that no one could quite explain, a subtle tightening of attention, like a held breath stretching just a second too long. And for the first time since this began, the certainty in Jake's posture flickered, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for him to feel it, that small, unfamiliar hesitation creeping in as he watched her turn the cloth over in her hands with quiet familiarity. She did not rush, did not glance around for approval, did not acknowledge the audience that had gathered behind her. Instead, she lifted the cloth calmly and tied it over her eyes with steady precision, not fumbling, not adjusting more than necessary, as if she had done this before, not once, not twice, but enough times that it had become routine, and that detail, that small detail, landed differently now, echoing louder than any words could have. A murmur rippled through the crowd, softer this time, uncertain, the earlier amusement thinning into something else, something closer to curiosity, and Jake felt it slipping, that easy control he had over the room, the effortless dominance that came from knowing exactly how these situations played out, because this was no longer following the pattern he expected. "All right," he said, clearing his throat, trying to reclaim the moment. But his voice lacked just a fraction of its earlier edge, and he compensated by speaking louder, sharper. 10 shots, straight down the lane, take your time." The instructions sounded simple, almost generous, but everyone knew what he meant. They knew the unspoken part, that she would hesitate, that she would miss, that she would confirm the assumptions they had all already made. Emily stood still for a moment after the cloth was secured, her posture relaxed, her shoulders level, And then she did something no one anticipated. She exhaled slowly, deliberately, as if everything around her, the lights, the whispers, the presence of the crowd, had faded into nothing, leaving only the space in front of her, measured not in sight but in something deeper, something internal. Jake watched closely now, his eyes narrowing, searching for signs of uncertainty, for any indication that this was about to fall apart. But instead, he saw control, not the loud, showy kind he was used to, but something quieter, something more precise, and it unsettled him in a way he could not immediately understand. Someone in the back shifted their weight, another lowered their phone slightly, as if unsure whether to keep recording, and the room grew quieter still, the kind of silence that was not commanded but formed naturally, built from the slow realization that they might have misjudged the situation entirely. Emily adjusted her stance by a fraction of an inch, her feet aligning with quiet intention, her hands moving with a smooth, practiced rhythm that did not match the image they had all formed of her just moments ago. And for a brief second, a memory flickered across her mind. Not in full detail, just fragments, the echo of instructions given long ago, the discipline of repetition, the understanding of distance without relying on sight, and it passed as quickly as it came, leaving behind only focus. Jake opened his mouth as if to say something, to interrupt, to reassert control, but the words did not come, because something in the room had already changed, something he could feel but not stop. And as Emily stood there, blindfolded, completely still, the confidence he had at the beginning of this moment began to feel less like certainty and more like a mistake he was only just starting to recognize. The first sound did not come from the crowd. It came from her breath, steady and measured, a quiet inhale followed by a controlled release that seemed to settle the entire space around her. And then, without hesitation, Emily Carter moved. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a calm precision that immediately drew every eye in the room. Her posture aligned as if guided by something deeper than sight, her shoulders relaxed, her stance grounded, and for a fraction of a second, time seemed to stretch, the fluorescent lights humming softly overhead, the distant shuffle of feet fading into nothing, until the only thing that remained was her presence at the lane. Jake Reynolds felt it before he understood it, that subtle shift from anticipation to uncertainty, and his arms, once folded with confidence, slowly dropped to his sides as his focus sharpened, no longer watching for failure, but searching for explanation. Emily's hands moved with quiet familiarity, positioning herself with a level of control that did not match the narrative anyone had built for her. And then it happened. The first action, clean, controlled, deliberate, followed by a stillness so complete that it forced the room into silence. A second passed. Maybe two. And then the target at 25 yards revealed the result. Precise, centered, undeniable. And for a moment, no one reacted, not because they did not see it, but because they did not yet understand it. Someone near the back let out a quiet breath, almost a whisper. Did that just? But the sentence never finished, because Emily had already reset, her stance unchanged, her focus unwavering, as if the outcome had been expected all along. Jake blinked, once, twice, his mind searching for the flaw, the coincidence, the explanation that would bring this back into the realm of what he understood. And when the second action followed, just as controlled, just as measured, landing with the same exact precision, the room shifted again, this time more visibly, heads tilting, bodies leaning forward, phones lowering as disbelief replaced amusement. The rhythm continued, not rushed, not dramatic, each movement intentional, each result consistent, and with every repetition, the silence deepened, growing heavier, more complete, until even the smallest sound seemed out of place, as if the entire space had agreed, without words, to witness what was unfolding without interruption. Jake felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, not fear, not exactly, but the unmistakable weight of being wrong, and it pressed against his earlier confidence, cracking it piece by piece as the pattern became impossible to ignore. Emily did not react to any of it, not the silence, not the shifting energy, not the growing realization around her. She remained centered, composed, as if this was not a performance, not a challenge, but something far more natural, something ingrained, By the time the sequence continued beyond what anyone had expected, the room was no longer watching for a mistake. They were waiting for confirmation, for the moment when this would stop being a coincidence and become undeniable truth. And Jake, standing just a few feet away, understood it before anyone said a word, that this was no longer about proving her wrong. It was about confronting the fact that he had never understood her at all, and that realization, quiet and absolute, settled into the space with a weight that no one could ignore. By the time the sequence reached its midpoint, something irreversible had already happened inside the room. A quiet but undeniable shift where disbelief no longer searched for explanation but began to accept what it was witnessing. And Emily Carter remained exactly the same, unmoved by the attention, unaffected by the silence that had grown so complete it almost felt physical, pressing against every surface, every person, every thought. Her movements did not change, not even slightly. Each action carried the same controlled rhythm, the same calm precision, as if repetition had carved it into her muscle memory long before this moment ever existed. And the target's downrange continued to reflect that truth with unsettling clarity. Each mark placed exactly where it should be, no deviation, no hesitation, no uncertainty. Jake Reynolds stood still now, completely still, the kind of stillness that does not come from control but from the absence of it. His earlier confidence now replaced by something far more uncomfortable, a slow realization that he had not just misjudged her, he had misjudged the entire situation from the very beginning. And that realization echoed louder than any words could have. He replayed the moment in his mind, her entrance, her silence, the way she had tied the cloth without hesitation, and each detail that once seemed insignificant now felt like a warning he had ignored, a pattern he had failed to recognize. Someone behind him shifted, their voice barely above a whisper. "This is not luck," and no one disagreed, because by now, luck was no longer part of the conversation. It had been replaced by something else entirely, something deliberate, something earned. Emily adjusted her stance again, just a fraction, the kind of movement that only someone deeply familiar with the environment would make. And for a brief second, another memory flickered beneath the surface, a controlled environment, measured distances, the quiet discipline of repetition, the understanding that precision did not come from sight alone, but from awareness, from consistency, from trust in something internal rather than external, and it passed as quickly as it came, leaving her exactly where she was, focused, composed, untouched by the weight of the moment unfolding around her. The sequence continued, each result reinforcing the last, building not toward a dramatic climax, but towards something more powerful, an undeniable certainty that settled deeper with every repetition, and the room responded in kind, not with noise, not with reaction, but with stillness, the kind that only forms when people realize they are witnessing something they cannot immediately explain. Jake felt it fully now, that quiet collapse of assumption, the uncomfortable awareness that the role he had assigned her no longer existed, that the narrative he had constructed had already been dismantled piece by piece, and there was nothing left to hold on to except the truth unfolding in front of him. His eyes remained fixed on her, no longer searching for flaws, no longer expecting failure, but trying to understand how someone so unassuming, so deliberately overlooked, could carry this level of control without ever needing to announce it, without ever needing to prove it until now. And as Emily prepared for what would come next, the room held its breath once more, not out of doubt, but out of anticipation, because the question had changed. It was no longer whether she could do it, it was how far this would go, and what it would reveal about everything they thought they knew. The final stretch did not feel like a performance anymore. It felt like a quiet unraveling of everything the room had believed just minutes ago, and Emily Carter stood at the center of it, unchanged, unshaken, her posture as steady as it had been from the beginning, as if the weight of expectation, the silence, the eyes watching her from every direction, none of it had any effect on what she was doing, because for her, this was not about them at all. Another controlled breath, another subtle shift of balance, and the sequence continued, each movement flowing into the next with a precision that no longer surprised but still refused to be fully understood. And downrange, the pattern had become undeniable, a clean alignment that spoke not of chance, not of repetition alone, but of mastery so deeply ingrained it no longer required effort. Jake Reynolds felt the moment slip further from his control with every passing second. The certainty he once carried now replaced by something far heavier, a quiet recognition that this was no longer his stage, that whatever narrative he had tried to create had already been rewritten without his permission, and he could do nothing but watch it unfold. He glanced briefly at the others, searching for confirmation, for some shared disbelief that might ground him, but what he saw instead was something else entirely, a collective stillness, eyes fixed, expressions tightened, as if everyone had reached the same conclusion at the same time, but no one was ready to say it out loud. Emily adjusted her grip slightly, not out of uncertainty, but out of refinement, the kind of micro-adjustment that only comes from years of repetition, and for a fleeting moment, another fragment of her past surfaced, not in images, but in feeling, the discipline of standing still when everything demanded movement, the understanding that control was not about force but about consistency, and it settled into her again like it had never left. The next result came, just as precise, just as exact, and a faint sound escaped someone in the crowd, not laughter, not commentary, just a quiet exhale that carried more weight than any reaction before it, because by now, there was nothing left to question. Jake's jaw tightened, his thoughts racing, trying to reconstruct the version of reality where this made sense, where she was still the person he had dismissed, but that version no longer existed. It had been replaced entirely by the evidence in front of him, and the realization settled deeper, more uncomfortable with every passing second. Emily remained centered, her focus unbroken, as if she had already moved beyond the moment they were all trapped in, as if she had known from the beginning how this would end, and that quiet certainty radiated in a way that no one could ignore. The sequence approached its conclusion, not with tension, not with hesitation, but with the same calm inevitability that had defined every step so far, and the room, now completely silent, seemed to lean into that final moment without realizing it, drawn by something they could not fully explain. Jake took a slow breath, his earlier voice, his earlier confidence, feeling distant now, almost unfamiliar, and for the first time, he understood that this was not about proving anything. It was about revealing something that had always been there, something he had simply chosen not to see, and as Emily prepared to complete what she had started, the truth of that realization settled into the space with a quiet finality that no one could escape. The final action did not feel like an ending. It felt like a quiet confirmation of everything that had already been proven, and as Emily Carter stood there, still blindfolded, her presence carried a kind of calm authority that no one in the room could ignore anymore, not even Jake Reynolds, who now watched in complete silence, his earlier smirk long gone, replaced by a rigid stillness that revealed more than any reaction ever could. The air felt heavier now, not tense, but full, as if the space itself had absorbed what had just happened and was still trying to process it. And when Emily took her final measured breath, the room followed unconsciously, a collective pause that stretched just long enough to make the moment feel permanent. Her movement was the same as before, controlled, deliberate, nothing exaggerated, nothing rushed, and when the final result appeared downrange, it did not shock anyone the way the first had. It did something else entirely. It settled, it confirmed, it closed the question that had been building since the beginning, leaving behind a truth that no one could deny. For a few seconds, no one moved, no one spoke, because there was nothing left to say. The pattern was complete, the outcome undeniable, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with realization, with the quiet weight of understanding that something extraordinary had just unfolded in the most unassuming way possible. Jake felt it fully now, that internal shift he could not reverse. The recognition that his earlier words, his assumptions, his entire approach had been built on a foundation that no longer existed. And as he stood there, looking at the results he could not explain away, he understood something far more uncomfortable than being wrong. He understood that he had never taken the time to truly see what was in front of him. Emily remained still for a moment longer, as if allowing the silence to settle, as if giving the room time to catch up to what had already happened, and then, without any dramatic gesture, without any attempt to claim attention, She reached up and removed the cloth from her eyes. The light returned gradually, her gaze adjusting as she looked forward, not at the crowd, not at Jake, but at the targets themselves. And there was no surprise in her expression, no pride, no satisfaction, just quiet acknowledgement, as if she had simply completed something expected. A faint sound broke the silence, a small shift from someone near the back, but it quickly faded again, because the moment did not invite noise, it demanded reflection. Jake opened his mouth slightly, as if to speak, to say something that might restore balance, but the words did not come, because nothing he could say would undo what had already been revealed, and he knew it. Emily lowered her hands calmly, placing everything back with the same care she had shown from the beginning, her movements unhurried, her presence unchanged, and as she finally turned slightly, her eyes met Jake's for the first time since this began, steady, composed, not confrontational, not forgiving, simply clear, and in that brief exchange, without a single word spoken, the message landed with more weight than anything else that had happened, because it was not about proving him wrong. It was about showing him what he had failed to recognize, and as she stepped away from the lane with the same quiet confidence she had walked in with, the room remained silent, not out of shock anymore, but out of respect, a respect that had not been given at the beginning, but had now been earned in a way no one would forget. For a moment after Emily Carter stepped away, the room remained suspended in that same quiet stillness, as if no one wanted to be the first to break what had just settled over them. And even the faint hum of the fluorescent lights seemed louder now against the absence of voices. The targets downrange stood as silent proof, clean and precise, each mark aligned in a way that no one could dismiss. And people began to glance at one another, not with amusement anymore, but with a kind of shared realization, the unspoken acknowledgement that they had all witnessed something far beyond what they had expected when she first walked through the door. Jake Reynolds stayed where he was, his gaze fixed forward, not on Emily anymore, but on the pattern that had rewritten his certainty, and for the first time in a long time, he felt unsure of what to say, or if he had the right to say anything at all. Someone near the back cleared their throat quietly, another shifted their stance, but no one stepped forward, no one laughed, no one made a comment, because whatever this moment was, it did not belong to them anymore. Emily moved with the same calm intention as before, placing everything back exactly where it belonged, her hands steady, her expression unchanged, as if she had simply completed a routine task rather than something that had altered the atmosphere of the entire room. And that lack of reaction, that refusal to claim attention, carried more weight than any display of pride ever could. Jake finally took a slow step forward, the sound of his shoe against the polished floor echoing more loudly than it should have, drawing a few quiet glances in his direction. But when he stopped, the words he had been searching for still did not come, because every version of what he could say felt smaller than what had just happened. He looked at her again, really looked this time, not through the lens of assumption, not through the quick judgment he had relied on before, but with a clarity that came too late to change the beginning. And in that moment, he understood that the mistake was never hers, it had always been his. Emily paused briefly as if sensing the shift behind her, and without turning fully, she spoke, her voice calm, steady, carrying just enough to reach him without needing to rise above the quiet. You do not need to see everything to understand it. And the words settled into the space with a quiet finality, not directed as a challenge, not offered as a lesson, simply stated as truth. Jake lowered his gaze slightly, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement, the kind that does not require explanation, and when he looked back up, she was already moving toward the exit, her steps as measured as when she arrived, her presence fading just as quietly as it had appeared. The door opened with a soft sound, letting in a brief wash of daylight that cut across the polished floor, and as it closed behind her, the room remained still for a second longer before the world slowly returned. Conversations starting again in hushed tones, people stepping back in emotion, but nothing felt quite the same. Jake exhaled deeply, running a hand along the back of his neck, his earlier confidence now replaced by something more grounded, something quieter, and as he glanced one last time at the targets downrange, he knew this was not a moment he would forget, not because of what she had done, but because of what it had revealed about him. and that realization stayed with him long after she was gone. Long after the door had closed behind Emily Carter, the echo of that moment refused to leave the room, lingering in the quiet glances people exchanged and the slower, more thoughtful way they moved, as if something invisible had shifted in the air and settled into each person differently. Conversations returned, but they were softer now, measured, carrying a tone that had not been there before. Because what they had witnessed was not just a display of skill, it was a correction, a quiet but undeniable reminder that assumptions often say more about the observer than the person being observed. Jake Reynolds remained near the lane longer than anyone else, his posture no longer commanding attention, but grounded, reflective, his eyes tracing the pattern downrange one more time, not to question it, not to challenge it, but to understand what it had revealed about him, about the ease with which he had judged, the confidence with which he had dismissed, and how quickly all of it had unraveled when faced with something real. He replayed her words in his mind, not as a challenge, but as a truth he had overlooked for far too long, and for the first time, he did not try to defend himself against it. He accepted it, quietly, fully, the way real lessons tend to settle, without noise, without resistance. Across the room, a few of the regulars approached the targets, studying them up close. Their earlier smirks replaced by something closer to respect, and one of them shook his head slowly, not in disbelief, but in acknowledgement, as if admitting to himself that he had been wrong without needing to say it out loud. The range itself felt different now, not because anything had physically changed, but because the people inside it had, even if only slightly, even if only for this moment. Outside, the late afternoon light stretched across the pavement, and somewhere beyond the walls, Emily continued on her way, unchanged, carrying nothing from the room except the same quiet certainty she had walked in with, because for her, this had never been about proving anything to anyone. It had simply been a moment, one of many, where the world briefly caught up to what she already knew. Back inside, Jake finally turned away from the lane, his steps slower, more deliberate, and as he moved past the others, there was no need for explanation, no need for apology spoken aloud, because the shift in his demeanor said enough, and sometimes that is where real change begins, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet recognition of what must be different moving forward. The targets were eventually replaced, the lanes reset, and the rhythm of the range resumed, but something of that moment remained, woven into the memory of those who had been there, a subtle reminder that not everything is as it appears, and that the people we overlook often carry stories far deeper than we are willing to see. And as the day moved on, that understanding lingered, steady and clear, like a lesson that does not fade easily, one that waits patiently for the next time judgment comes too quickly. Respect often reveals itself when you least expect it. If you enjoy stories that uncover truth, dignity, and hidden strength, do not forget to like and subscribe. The next story might just change the way you see the world. Thank you so much for watching.